The courtroom was tense as Michael Carter, a tall man with sharp, weathered features, sat at the defendant's table, clutching his hands tightly in his lap. His uniform was no longer pressed and crisp like the day he'd been deployed, but it still spoke to the pride he had once felt. The Purple Heart pinned to his chest seemed to weigh heavier than it ever had before. Across from him, Judge Ellen McCarthy looked down, her spectacles gleaming with an air of formality that seemed to settle over the room like a heavy fog. Behind Michael, Shadow, his black Labrador service dog, lay calmly on the floor, a constant source of comfort for Michael. The dog's steady breathing, the way it followed every movement of Michael's hand, the soft and reassuring thud of its tail against the floor, all of it had become Michael's lifeline over the years. But today, it seemed as though even that wasn't enough. "You are hereby instructed to comply with the building's policy regarding pets, Mr. Carter." Judge McCarthy's voice rang out, cold and unyielding. "You have 10 days to remove your service animal from the premises. Failure to do so will result in further legal action." The words felt like a punch to Michael's gut. He had heard them, yes. He had even expected them. But hearing the finality in her voice sent a wave of disbelief through him. He had served his country. He had fought in wars, survived countless horrors. And now, after all he had given, a judge was telling him he had to choose between a roof over his head and the one thing keeping him from losing himself to the demons in his mind. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers and a few stifled breaths. A representative from the local housing authority, Linda Granger, shifted in her seat, adjusting her glasses. "Your Honor, the tenants have made multiple complaints about excessive noise," Linda chimed in, her voice smooth and confident. "The building's no pets policy has been in place for years. Mr. Carter's emotional attachment to the animal is not a legally binding reason for him to keep it here." Michael fought the urge to stand up and scream. The thought of living without Shadow made his chest tighten. His hand gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. Judge McCarthy didn't look up from her paperwork, her eyes scanning the case file as if this were just another routine decision. "The law is the law," she said firmly. And just like that, the decision was made. In the days that followed, Michael's world began to crumble around him. News of the court's decision spread like wildfire through the town. Veterans groups staged protests outside the courthouse. The community rallied behind Michael, sharing their stories of service, sacrifice, and struggle. A petition calling for the reversal of the decision amassed thousands of signatures within hours. But none of that mattered. Michael didn't feel the strength of the people's support. He didn't feel the comfort of the veterans' solidarity. What he felt was a suffocating sense of panic, a dark cloud of anxiety that made every breath feel like a struggle. Without Shadow by his side, every moment of every day felt like walking on the edge of a precipice. The nightmares returned with a vengeance. The sudden flashbacks, the cold sweats, the overwhelming sense of dread that gnawed at him, threatening to pull him under. Even in the safe confines of his apartment, he couldn't escape it. The walls seemed to close in on him. The quiet was too loud. On the morning of the follow-up hearing, Michael could barely find the strength to leave his apartment. His hands shook as he dressed. Shadow had been sent to a trainer for the week, a temporary arrangement, the only thing that could bring any semblance of peace to his heart. But without his constant companion, the world felt like a battleground. At the courthouse, as he waited to testify, the room was crowded. His head throbbed. His hands were slick with sweat. The oppressive way of eyes watching him made his heart race. And then, the familiar flicker of panic set in. His breath came in shallow gasps. The walls seemed to move closer. He stood, but his legs felt like lead. He had to speak. He had to explain the depth of the connection he had with Shadow. But the words wouldn't come. His mouth was dry, his thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. Before he could crumble, before he could retreat into himself entirely, something incredible happened. A low rumble echoed through the courthouse doors, and suddenly, The unmistakable sound of claws clicking on the marble floor reached his ears. The crowd stirred, confused, as a sleek black figure made its way into the room. Shadow, Michael's constant companion, emerged from the hallway, nose to the ground, eyes locked on Michael. Without a moment's hesitation, the dog trotted to his side, nudging his hand with a gentle push of its nose. Michael didn't have to say anything. Shadow knew. The dog sat at his feet, a silent sentinel, its presence grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of his own mind. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Michael's hands shook as he reached down to pat Shadow's head, the familiar softness of the dog's fur calming him. It was as though time had stopped. The weight of the room, the heavy silence, the cold stares from the judge, all seemed to fade away in the presence of his dog. Judge McCarthy, who had once been so resolute in her decision, looked on in disbelief. The gavel was still in her hand, but it seemed to have lost its power. The law, once her guiding force, no longer felt like enough. She glanced at the defendant's table and then at the dog, who now lay quietly at Michael's feet. "Your Honor," a voice called from the back of the room. It was a veteran, someone who had been quietly watching the proceedings. "What we need is not just the law, but understanding. This man has served our country. He's given more than most can imagine. And this dog is his lifeline. We don't need to see it in black and white. We need to feel it." The judge's stern expression softened, just slightly, as she looked at Michael, at the bond between him and Shadow. The tension in the room was palpable as the crowd held their collective breath. Finally, Judge McCarthy stood, her robe sweeping the floor as she motioned for silence. "Court is adjourned for recess," she declared. "I need time to review the facts. This is more than just a case. It's about human dignity." Minutes felt like hours as the courtroom waited in anticipation. Michael stayed seated, his head bowed, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. Shadow remained calm, as always, beside him. When Judge McCarthy returned, the room stood in reverence. "I've reviewed the case further," she began. "The law does not exist in a vacuum, and sometimes it is not enough. Michael Carter, I hereby reverse my decision. Shadow is not just a pet. Shadow is an essential part of your life, and the law recognizes that." The courtroom erupted into applause, but Michael barely heard it. He looked down at Shadow, his eyes welling with tears. "We did it," he whispered, as the dog's tail wagged gently beneath the table. And for the first time in days, Michael allowed himself to breathe, knowing he wouldn't have to face the world alone again.